massive bad data is this is just from 2016. It was the IBM survey. It was like 3.1 trillion US dollars. Now imagine what it is now, where enterprises have tons of data, but oftentimes they lack the context to inform their decision. And on top of it, from this HBR studies, that only 3% of data is actually used at companies to inform decisions. And in a study from even 2018, is that 91% of orgs have not yet reached a transformational level of data usage. So the big takeaway is that data alone paints a very dangerously incomplete picture. It doesn't automatically lead to informed choices, higher profits, or new customers because it's missing that context. And this is something I talked a lot about in my TED talk that Krishna had referenced. I'm not going to go through it now because you can find it online. But the quick TLDR is just that I lived my time a period of time becoming a street vendor, living with migrants while I was working at Nokia. And at that time in 2006, Nokia was the largest cell phone maker in the world, and it was the most famous. And they made these phones that were clearly not a smartphone back then. But at the time, what I observed by living with migrants, and my story of what I realized, wow, context is super important for enterprises, is that here's a large company, but I was sending them pictures back of migrant workers using phones that look like iPhones, that look like smartphones, but clearly if you look closely at the screen, this is not an iPhone. It is what's called a Shansai phone, which is a copy phone. Based on that data point of living with families for a couple years and just documenting and really understanding a sociological take of Chinese society and where things were going with emerging behavior, this unknown behavior, I essentially went to Nokia, who had billions of customer data points. And I was like, hey, you have billions of customer data points, but I have just a few years of observations with 30 or plus families that they're not going to want to buy your phone in a couple years because this thing called the iPhone that everyone thought was crazy because it was so expensive. Who's going to want to buy it? I was like, hey, warning, I think your company is not going to exist in a few years because everyone's going to want to buy an iPhone, at least, or a copy of it. And this is an emergent behavior. I was like, you're not going to see this in your existing data set. And so anyways, they didn't listen. This is what happened to Nokia at the time when I told them. They were at, this is their $38 per share back in 2007. And Apple was $4.30 a share. And they were like, Trisha, you're crazy. You're an ethnographer and you're not a C-suite person who's been with our company forever. So why would you tell us that, And so I was like, well, I have real observations on the ground. I have real context that's emergent. And so anyways, Nokia didn't listen. Their business tumbled. We all know the story of Nokia. We're all holding smartphones of some sort, right? And we're not holding a Nokia phone. And so the big takeaway is that not everything valuable is measurable. And this lesson is incredibly important because one of my hypotheses for what we have observed at Sudden Compass is that as more companies are using software that relies on big data, and in particular, even more as we're going into an era where companies are using cloud-based enterprise, AI native tools, is that there's increasing risk of what I call the quantification bias, which is the unconscious belief of valuing the measurable over the immeasurable. I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but when you're talking to someone and you're like, I know based off of experience and based off of real data that's not quantified, but I saw something happen, or I had a customer tell me this and it sits right with all those other things we're hearing, but you didn't have what your observation was or insight in the form of a pie chart, in the form of math, in the form of numbers. You couldn't say, oh, 20% of customers have said this, so we are at a risk of, XYZ happening in 10 months or whatever. That you couldn't share whatever it is because that person or your manager or your team couldn't have processed the information because it didn't come in the form of numbers. So this is what I call the quantification bias. And it's really, really dangerous because the quantification bias privileges data that only is measurable. That means anything that is unknown, that doesn't have a number attached to it, like what I had shared with Nokia, is really deprioritized and seen as, not valuable. But the thing is, as Rory Sutherland from Ogilvy says, all big data comes from the same place, the past. And big data is the fuel that drives all these AI tools. So if we know that enterprises are at a risk of the quantification bias, and you don't want to become a Nokia, you don't want to be the company that says, oh, we're so comfortable in our numbers. How do we start taking advantage of data as an asset in our organization? Do we just throw data away? I mean, obviously the answer is no. The answer is you want to use these kind of tools, but how do we do it in a way where it doesn't put us at greater risk?